So let's just go way back to Web Forms Web 1.0. And this is really whenever the web was conceived. The form element was created in the HTML spec 2, I believe, which was 1995. And from that point all the way up until about 2000, there was really this static form system. And I know that's really kind of hard to read. This is a JS Fiddle, so if you're looking at this online, here's the form element. Right next to it you have this action keyword. And then this is actually pointing to a back-end service. Back whenever web was 1.0, this action was really, it was almost kind of like the W3C committee just punted and said, you guys figure that out. All we're doing is providing specs for the form up front. Inside of here, you have a lot of input elements as well as submissions. The result would actually look something like this, although this is way more beautiful than you would have found in Web 1.0. Simply because we now have Bootstrap and all the like, and I'm actually using that because if you don't use that, forms just kind of look ugly. So this is what it looked like. So this is the static HTML website. There is one major takeaway that I want you guys to take away from this, which is back in Web 1.0, the way that this worked is definitely something to take note of, which is you would have the application here, and here you have a form. And whenever you would go to a website, that would actually send a request to the server. Inside that request, you would have what file or what HTML file you're actually requesting. So this was a GET request, and I want to go to the create.html file. The server would then actually look in its file system, find that HTML file, and hand that to the client with the form included. It's a very important thing to take away because that's kind of what's changing in today's terms that we're trying to address. We had that one-to-one connection based on the request and the file that was actually retrieved. From that point, templating, a lot of people figured out that, hey, from the server's perspective, I can take that request, execute some logic to actually build this thing dynamically and hand that back to the client so that they feel like they're requesting an HTML file. But what's really happening from the server's perspective is that's going in and that's executing some PHP. PHP is then going and talking to a MySQL database or whatever database you want to talk to. And from there, it quite literally constructs a form, dynamically builds the page, and then hands that to the client. This really started sparking another evolution of the web. It was actually given a label, Web 2.0. And the reason why this was given a name was because now the web became dynamic. Users could contribute to content of the web. And out of that really sparked this next generation of web forms. And where web forms were now not this static thing that you write inside of HTML, you use back-end logic, back-end PHP, or whatever server language that you want to use to really construct the forms. And I do want to mention that this is still the major majority in today's terms. If you're going to go and find a job out developing for some company, this is what they're doing today. One major takeaway still is even in today's terms, the user is requesting the interface from the server. So the server is responsible for handing the user and saying, this is the interface that you need to use to interface with me. That's one really important thing to take away from this discussion because all of that is kind of being flipped on its head right now. And that's really what I want to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about Web Forms 2.0, 2000 and today. Out of Web Forms 2.0 came this major movement where these frameworks started coming out of the woodworks. You have Symfony, you have Drupal, you have WordPress. I'm kind of anchoring to Drupal right here because that's my background. Excuse me. That's what I know a lot of. In fact, I came from Drupal. But Drupal, in my mind, represents everything that's in the market today, what you find. Even in Node.js, Sales, you were mentioning Sales. Sales is even this way. And Sales is a very modern framework where these are back-end frameworks that have these mechanisms for dynamically still generating content and handing it to the user as an interface. And in fact, Drupal came out with their own schema definitions for forms. And I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with other back-end frameworks, but I would be willing to bet a lot of money that every framework on the market has some answer to dynamically building forms on the back end using some object schema. Like Symfony, like you're building an array, a PHP array, and that PHP array is to represent the form on the front end. Drupal has this. And it looks a little bit something like this. PHP kind of makes me like twitch a little bit now, even though I wrote this for many, many years.
Is that 7 code?
This is 7.
Okay. 8's simple.
8's different.
Yeah,
However, 8 still has this paradigm. And the paradigm is that you're building the form on the back end. The back end is constructing the form, and that form is then handed to the user. And this is what everyone deals with today. In fact, there's really nothing telling people otherwise. And you know what? I'd like to say that this actually has worked very well for a really long time. In fact, life was good for a really long time for a developer. You're a developer, you're building Drupal websites, your customers are happy, they've got a website that works, or as a developer I can write arrays in my PHP code, and those arrays are immediately translated into a form. Life is good. Then this happened. So what happened, and I really do attribute this to the iPhone, and I don't think I'm the only one that's going to attribute it to the iPhone. The iPhone really kind of rocked the market. And what the iPhone did is it now represented this new interface that was introduced into the market. So now no longer were people looking at their websites on a big screen. They're looking at it on a phone. In fact, I know because I was actually experienced this. I was a victim of this, and you guys are developers, and I would actually say all of you guys were a victim as well. We're developers. We don't make much money. However, our bosses make a lot of money, and our bosses were the ones that went to the iPhone store to get their new iPhone, the little shiny new iPhone, and what's the first thing they're going to do, right? They're going to, I want to check out my fancy website on this brand new phone. And they immediately look at it and like, this looks like crap. This looks like garbage. And that's what happened, is because now developers were faced with this massive problem because their bosses were unhappy, their customers were unhappy. Suddenly everyone was unhappy with the way things were, right? And it really happened overnight. And it was all attributed to these new interfaces. So this new interface was introduced. And so in a big scramble, developers came out with these new ways of building applications, and they said to themselves, we need to do things differently. Right now, our current way of building apps and building websites is not working. We need to build apps differently. In fact, they gave it a label. If you're going to build a website, build it what? Mobile first. Mobile first. They said we got to make these things responsive. And so what ended up happening is then whenever you go to college now and you go and interview for a job, they're going to hang their hat that they're mobile first. Everyone's going to hang their hat that they're mobile first. And what actually happened here, in my opinion, mobile first did not solve the problem. Mobile first is kind of a Band-Aid. Because there's one thing to really take away from mobile first. And what I want you guys to take away is that the server still provides the interface. It still provides the forms. What's really happening here is that a mobile first website, you're looking at it on a mobile device, that request is still going to the server's still going into the backend, it's still churning, it's still going through the form API to build the form, and then it hands the interface to the phone. It's just that interface now is flexible. It can flow, and it looks good on all devices. And everyone is happy. In fact, life was good. Life is good again, right? For the past 4 years, I don't think any of you guys will disagree, life has been pretty good. We solved that problem. We're good. Then this happened. So what's happening right now is that no more are interfaces the only things that are hitting our servers. No more can we create an interface that has a form and it now is able to achieve all of the data input into my server. In fact, your watch would love to use the same interfaces that you use as a human to input data. It wants to input the data the same way, and in fact, it's trying to. It can't because Drupal it can't handle it. And there's a major uproar in Drupal right now because of this. But these devices are causing a problem. No more do we have to cater our interfaces to human interaction. I want you guys to put that in your mind. Humans will probably very, very shortly in the future account for 1/5 of your traffic. And because humans are slow, we're just slow compared to machines. Your Fitbit, your Apple Watch is wanting to submit data 5 times as fast, and guess what? It is wanting to use this thing called an API. And because we have built our entire systems, our structure of our servers, and the way that forms and the way that data works on this old paradigm that the server's responsible for basically creating the interface, we've locked ourselves into a system that does not cater to APIs. How many of you have built APIs in your system, but the API logic is completely separate from the form handling logic? It happens a lot right now. And the reason why you have to do that is because we are trying to essentially retrofit this API thing in response to have also needing form submissions. So we have ourselves a problem happening right now. But there's a solution. And the solution really starts with the forms. And that's what I really would like to argue, because forms represent, get this in your minds, forms are the user interface of an API. If you were to construct an API and say, I need a user interface for this API, that UI is a form. And I don't think many of you will argue to that. A form is a way to input data. It's a way to actually get that data into the system. So let's talk about web forms for the future, which is called Web Forms 3.0. With this movement, and this movement has actually been labeled Web 3.0. A lot of you probably have heard that tossed around right now. This movement of this shaking of what's happening in the web. In fact, there's a lot of frameworks that are just cropping out of the woodworks because of this. AngularJS is one, and I will talk a little bit about that, and I'll talk about React as well. These frameworks are coming out of the woodwork because of this new Web 3.0 mandate, in that applications now must be made differently. There has to be a total separation between the front end and the back end, where the front end application must only communicate to the back end via APIs. And I know this is a bold statement, but mobile first is no longer good enough. In fact, we really need to kind of rethink how we're building applications. And what I'd like to propose is that instead of mobile first, we need to start thinking API first. Because API first actually puts you in the mindset that what really matters is that your server becomes this API engine, and everything on top of it is the app. And it creates this total separation between the application and the back-end API server. So let's talk a little bit about what API first development means, and I will get into JSON-powered forms. I promise you. I have to get off my soapbox first. So the first thing you need to do is you need to build your REST platform first. Your REST platform must be stateless. This means you're not storing cookies and session and using that cookie to establish session. JWT authentication has become a really popular thing these days. It's something we use at Form.IO. It provides a very stateless way to manage users and scale as well. Your first app should be an API test. And applications must only use those APIs, including forms. So why API first? The answer to this, I believe, is that it forces us to develop websites like web applications. And I would like for us to start using those terms separately. For many years, developers would build a website and they're like, yeah, I build web apps. And I think there should be a very distinct difference between a web application and a website. Website is when the server sends the website to the user's interface. A web application is this thing that exists all on its own. So there are a lot of platforms that are API first. A lot of things you can use today. We have AngularJS, React, Ember, Backbone. I wanted to put Jekyll on here because Jekyll, in my opinion, represents something very interesting, which is static site generation. Have any of you guys done much with static site generation? You're basically building an entire front-end website that makes you feel like you're using PHP code to do it. But it basically builds a static website. And then, of course, Ionic. Somebody mentioned that they have an interest in Ionic. Ionic is actually Angular themed for the mobile device. So now we have this problem. And the problem is, now that our applications are completely separated from the front end to the back end, we now kind of have to go back to our roots, right? When you're building an app now and you want to build a form, you have to go to the HTML docs. You have to go to Bootstrap and say, how do I have to build an HTML form. And I'm just going to say it, but the good old-fashioned way sucks. Because it's no longer dynamic. You're no longer writing the schema on the back end that generates a form. You now have to actually write this entire form code on the front end to actually get that into your AngularJS application. So now with that said, I'd like to introduce, or I'm not introducing, this is actually a very well-known concept, which is dynamic form, JSON-powered forms. And this is a major movement that's happening in the web. It's happening in AngularJS. So it all really means that you're taking this form definition, this form schema, and you are now letting the client do it for you. So with the Drupal API, the Form API, what it was doing, it was taking this PHP array, and that PHP array was defining the structure of the form. Now what we're saying is the form structure should be a JSON schema. And that JSON schema is used to define the form. You guys are already doing this in your back-end applications. What we're saying now is let your back-end servers manage data. Don't let it manage the form, the PHP code that defines a form. So this JSON schema is then provided to the application via an API. So the application, instead of requesting a form, it actually just requests schemas. And that JSON schema is handed to a rendering engine, which is a JavaScript library. So this JavaScript renderer takes this schema and then dynamically renders it on the page in real time.